Latin American and Caribbean governments who are joining us, and to each and every one of you for being here today on the other side of the screen. Our most sincere thanks to each and every one of you. Thanks to the entire team at RedCLARA, a team that I truly love, and the Click Group in charge of the platform on which this event is taking place. Thank you so much for your great commitment and great work. We are also thankful for the privilege of being able to work with all of you, and we encourage you to share your comments and impressions on this last day of TICAL2021, the 5th Latin American meeting on e-science, using hashtag #ConfTICAL2021 and on this platform's wall. And we also ask that you please help us in completing the surveys to make this conference increasingly better year after year. Today, we have a very intense program, jam-packed with very interesting content. In fact, we even began 1 hour sooner. And this content will be presented to you by our dear Paola Arellano, the Executive Director of the Chilean Academic Network, REUNA, and a longtime friend. Ever since I began, and I was very little working in REUNA, because I was very little. Go ahead, Paola. Hello and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon also for those of you joining us from elsewhere. I'd like to greet everyone who is joining us on this final day of TICAL, a conference that I particularly have greatly enjoyed. And if I'm somewhat tired, I can't imagine how all of you are. So I will start by introducing a fellow countryman, our first presenter, who I had the pleasure of meeting many years ago when the Data Chile initiative began, César Hidalgo. César is a Chilean academic known for his contributions to the economic complexity and data visualization and applied artificial intelligence. César is the head of the Collective Learning Center for Artificial Natural Intelligence Institute, ANITI, in Toulouse University. He's also an honorary professor at Manchester University and an adjunct professor in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard. Between 2010 and 2019, he led the Collective Learning Group at MIT, going from assistant professor to associate professor. Before working at MIT, he was a researcher at the Kennedy School of Governance at Harvard, and is the head of a visualization and data distribution company. He has a doctorate in physics from Notre Dame University and a degree from Universidad Católica de Chile in physics. His contributions have been recognized with several awards, including the Lagrange Award in 2018 and 3 Webby Awards. César is also an author of a dozen articles and 3 books, one of which we will be learning about today. To provide some context, I'd like to recall what Martin talked about on Tuesday about what artificial intelligence, on how artificial intelligence is used for women and people of color and other groups, showing that there may be a bias when it comes to addressing these groups, and showing how the systems can even make mistakes. And I've been reading about how scary it might even be that machines know us so well. So how do we engage with machines? I mean, many years ago, I went to Santa Maria to go to the movies at Santa Maria University. And I was watching 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I felt it very real. I thought, how terrible. How are we going to feel when machines are totally around us? And they truly already are. So I'll leave you now with César to tell us how humans judge machines. César, please go ahead. Thank you very much, Paola. Thank you, Maria Jose, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, despite doing this from Toulouse, France. And what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about my latest book, a book that, as Paula mentioned, is about understanding how we humans play machines. And why are we interested in this? Well, there are several reasons. On one hand, we know that artificial intelligence is increasingly an essential part of our society. And also, we know that artificial intelligence affects us and also makes mistakes. But the way in which we interpret those mistakes tells us often many times about human psychology, more so than artificial intelligence itself. It is we who see these machines and who ultimately provide a moral judgment on their actions, either positive or negative. And as artificial intelligence begins to become more popular, and as these issues are discussed, we see how we judge machines when compared to people, because we are judging machine behavior. And for that, we need to have a way to compare that criteria, that judgment, if it were done by a human. So a few years ago, our team started to gather data experimentally, and what we did was do several clinical studies where a group of approximately 200 people evaluated an action, such as an action of a machine, and another 200 people would evaluate that same action, but thinking it was a human. And what we tried to do in this exercise was to see if, when an action is presented by a machine, or if the action is presented by a human, what differences there would be in reactions. And there were different reactions, because with these kinds of studies, we can basically isolate the effect of changing the party executing the action. So some of what we'll be doing today is look at several scenarios on how machines and humans are judged in the same scenario. And then we will take the data from that to see how people judge machines. So to see how these experiments work, I'll be showing you one scenario. In this scenario, an excavator is digging a new building site, and without knowing it, the site contains a grave. The operator or machine does not realize that there's a grave there and digs in the site, thus revealing human remains. So the question in this case is, would you judge the machine differently if this action would have been done by an automatic excavator or by a human operator? And the way in which we answer this question is not by asking a person to say they would have done it differently or not, but instead we use two different groups of people who never even knew that there was another group that was evaluating that same situation, but with a different operator. So that's what really allows us to have this inference. And then we compared how people reacted to this scenario in these two groups. So for example, we asked, do you think the action was harmful? Or would you hire this driver for a similar position? Do you think the action was intentional? Do you like the driver? How morally wrong or right was the driver's action? Do you agree that the driver should be promoted to a position with more responsibilities, or replaced by an algorithm, replaced by a machine? Do you believe that the machine or the operator responsible for digging up the human remains were responsible for digging up the human remains? And ultimately, if you were in a similar situation, would you have done the same? And the results are seen in charts such as this, where basically what we see are dots and lines. The dots show us the average. So for example, when we ask people, how much harm did you find in this scenario? This is the average that we found when presenting the action through a machine. And in blue is the average when the action is presented as a human being. And these little bars are the range of reliability. So when there's a major space between them, there is a huge difference. In this case, there's a p-value here where the likelihood of both answers being the same are 14 zeros after a 1. 1 and 14 zeros after another 1. And when they are closer, in this case, well, the machine is considered to be more harmful than humans. Here, the person would hire a human, not a machine. The intent here is roughly the same. That is, people see it as quite accidental. And people, for example, assess humans in a much better way under these dimensions. They like the humans more. The moral action was more appropriate, and they would also be promoted. But then let's look at another scenario. This next scenario is somewhat more interesting because now we are looking at we're looking at three scenarios with the same action but three possible results. So we have a tsunami that is approaching a coastal town, and this could entail devastating consequences. There is a politician or an algorithm that is responsible for the town's safety, and they can try to evacuate everyone with a likelihood of 50% of success, or save half of the town at a 100% success. So this is a scenario that strikes two moral dimensions, specifically the damage or harm dimension, and the other is fairness, because you would have to choose who would be evacuated. And there are three possible situations. We actually have 6 groups of different people who would be evaluating this. So the first is that the politician or algorithm tries to save everyone, but the effort fails. In this case, the town is devastated and a large number of people die. So this is the risk being taken, and then the result is unfortunate. Then we have, again, the politician or algorithm tries to save everyone, and they are successful. In this case, they assumed the risk, and it was a fortunate outcome. And lastly, we have where the politician or the algorithm tries to save only half of the town, and we know what happens there. So how do people react in this case? So here we have the 3 charts. Let's start with the right one, where we look at the case where the politician or the algorithm decides to save half the town. Here, for the most part, what we see is that there are no major differences. Most of these variables that I've circled here do not have any significant or major difference. And on average, people find human actions to be more intentional. And the only major difference that we found here under this question, where we ask, would you replace the machine by a human, or would you replace the human by a machine? The machine that tried to save only half the town, people would replace it. And the human that tried to save half the town, people do not want to replace that person. But the differences are not that large. Now let's look at the middle chart. This is the fortunate results where they tried to save everyone and they succeeded. Obviously, this is a result where people do not see much harm because it was a successful rescue. But here we do see that people have a much better take on humans than machines, despite the machines and the humans doing the same thing. They took the same action with the same results. But people find, for example, the humans were much more intentional. They like humans more. The decisions were more morally correct, etc. Lastly, we have the unfortunate case. Here you try to save everyone but failed. And here, people see more harm in the machine. And people, in this case, do not see the human as being as intentional as in the other case. People report that they like the humans and they don't like the machines. They find that the machine is less morally correct as opposed to humans. And what we see is that we don't really look at these scenarios based on results or scenarios, but instead there's a major part of the evaluation that depends on who is executing the action, if it's a human or a machine. Here we see, for example, that the evaluation is much more negative when a machine carried out the action. And this shows us something that we will be generalizing later on. And it's this idea that humans are being judged by what they're trying to do. Humans are judged for trying to save the people, and the machines are more judged by the results for having failed. So basically, when we see a scenario such as the machine's action or human action, we evaluate it differently because the human action is evaluated from a standpoint that is more Kantian, to speak in more philosophical terms, and the machine is more on the utilitarian side of things, and that creates a major difference. Now let's continue with the results. Now we see an autonomous vehicle. a self-driving vehicle that is working for a supermarket chain, or a driver that's working for a supermarket chain and accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. This is an interesting case because basically we can see that the responsibility was not, it wasn't the vehicle or the driver's fault. In this case, it was the pedestrian's fault who jumped in front of the car. And if you have any, and if you have any doubts about this, the people who took this survey only see the text. They do not see anything graphic. So how was this evaluated? Here, once again, we find that the machine action is more harmful. It is worse off in its evaluation. Also, humans are liked more, less the machine. They find the human action to be slightly more moral than a machine. But what's interesting here is this dimension, the intent. In previous examples, people had said that the machine's action was less intentional than human. But here, we see that the machine's action is slightly more intentional than human. Not because people see much intent in the machine, but instead they are able to fully forgive humans and are not able to forgive machines fully. We did this also with a separate victim. Instead of a human, it was a dog. And then other situations that cause an accident, a tree falls over because of wind. And the results were very consistent in the 4 exercises. What we are seeing then is that we assess the intent of machines and humans differently. Humans, when they are in a situation that is fully accidental, we are able to forgive them and to basically have this judgment where, despite having caused harm, because in this case, there was a lot of harm done by humans, we are nevertheless still able to pardon them, and not so much for machines. Machines still have this residual guilt. Then we see that there are interesting differences. And we also started to ask several questions. So, for example, do we think that machines have intent? This might seem strange. And this is something that is highly debated. But the way that I have found that is easy to understand this debate, or at least have a framework that would allow you to understand it, is that intent or agency should be thought of as a continuum, not as something that is either had or not had. For example, a human adult has full agency, but a teen has less agency than a human, and the 2 or 3-year-old child has very little agency, and in fact, they have no legal responsibility for their actions because of that lack of agency. So it's a continuum that constantly changes, and the same happens with animals, and the same happens also with machines. A toaster has less agency than an autonomous vehicle. And why? Because when we start to think about agency, we can also start to think about the various ways in which intelligence is able to decide. For example, a self-driving vehicle that is designed to protect pedestrians at any cost or protect drivers at any cost might make a different decision in an unexpected situation, but they would basically respond as intended. So in this case, there would be a certain agency when deciding action, but not what action, not when deciding what action. Now, if you can say that and there you can say that there's even greater agency. The smarter the machines are, the more agency they will have along this continuum. Where on the left-hand side, so to speak, we would have zero agency, such as a rock, and on the extreme right, we would have full agency, as a human adult would have. Machines would be at some point in between. They wouldn't be a rock, but they wouldn't be a human. And depending on the various capacities, they would move along this continuum. This is something that's been studied previously. This is, for example, a paper from 2007 from Science magazine, where they are assessing how people, what people think about the various mental models in several entities, adults, humans, babies, animals, fetuses, babies, dogs, etc. as well. And what they found is that, please slow down slightly for the interpreters, thank you. And what we found is that there are 2 dimensions that help with these mental models. The first is the agency, and the other dimension is the dimension of experience. The agency dimension is this capability of doing things, of deciding the goals, deciding the action. The experience is the capacity of feeling. You can feel hunger, You can feel shame, and the machine is assessed as something that does not have experience, does not have feelings, but a certain level of agency. Now, we've seen that in these scenarios, machines do not fare very well. In general, we find that machines have been evaluated in the sense, and the only thing that happens then is that people tend to prefer humans and not so much machines. And if that were the only case, if that were all, well, then maybe all this work would not be worthwhile, because it's a quite simple conclusion. But we do find that there are situations where we can revert this effect. We can create scenarios where people evaluate machines better than humans. For example, a family has a robot or a person in charge of cleaning their house. One day, the family finds that this person or robot used an old national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then threw it away. So we have a moral dilemma that is quite difficult. This isn't somebody getting run over or anything like that, but instead, this is a more of at the level of authority and loyalty and purity. And what we see in these cases is that in this scenario, the people are finding that the machine's action was more morally correct than the human. And they find that they would like, that they like the machine more than the human. And also that they would more likely hire the machine than a human. So we basically see that we are able to revert this effect. Here we find another example where the machine is better off than humans morally when committing the same act. So this is somewhat more complicated than simply having people like machines or not, or rather liking humans and not machines. Moving on to another chapter. In this chapter, we see the algorithmic biases. And as Paolo was saying, this was a subject at the conference. And what we're doing here is seeing how people react to a bias in a decision-making process done by a machine or done by a human. And this bias is interesting because the concept of justice has evolved greatly with artificial intelligence's evolution, because it has forced it has forced us to take justice to a different level. When we look at justice as an algorithm or process or system, there are many ways of defining what is fair. Fair what? Equal opportunities, positive cases, negative cases. So basically, there's a theorem of impossibility that tells us that we cannot satisfy all of these definitions of justice simultaneously. That is why, and this is a subject that's really interesting, because we basically then must choose. There are certain dimensions of justice that we can satisfy to see other, and there are other dimensions of justice that we cannot fully satisfy simultaneously. The examples in this case are scenarios that touch on the subject of justice, of fairness, and it's done in the following way. So a company, for example, replaces the HR manager with a manager or an algorithm that must screen candidates for job interviews. And we have two types of cases. One case where the treatment is unfair. And in this case, an audit reveals that the new algorithm or manager never selects candidates who are Hispanic or ethnic minorities. And in the fair treatment case, we find that the manager or the algorithm has a fairer process for ethnic minorities. So there's a case where this new system reduces fairness, and this other new system helps to increase fairness. And we have several similar scenarios pertaining to universities, police, salary raises, but the results are quite similar. So let's just look at one. This is the case of unfair treatments. What do we find here? We find that, on one hand, people evaluate they evaluate the humans a little bit harsher than machines. Basically, the human caused more harm than a machine that did the same thing, despite the machine also being attributed with much harm. In general, we also find that the differences in other dimensions that that have had significant differences. There are some that have very little differences. For example, in liking the machine of the humans, we do see a major difference here in intent. It is considered that humans acting unfairly do so intentionally, almost irrefutably. They are attributed with that intent, whereas the machine not so much. But we do see that there is slightly more harm attributed to humans and slightly less moral correctness in their actions. But many dimensions are similar. In the fair treatment, we also see that there are many results that are similar. For example, when we look at how much they like the machine or like the human, and whether or not they were morally correct, that is all equal. But they do see human actions here as being having more intent, but that intent does not translate into judgment, as we saw previously. So we see different scenarios. Here we're talking about fairness or justice, and in this case, the differences are not very much. In this case, the scenario, in this scenario, it matters more if it's a machine or a human. And there are two parts that are really interesting that I'd like to highlight here. The first is that when we compare the unfair case and the fair case, what we see is the following. People would rather replace a machine where fairness went up than the case where there was a human that reduced justice. That is, here we see a very strong algorithmic bias against the machine, very strong. Although the criteria or the judgment is very similar when asking if the machine would be replaced by a human, when the machine was fair, the response was stronger than when asking if you would replace a human by a machine when the human was unfair. So people, so to speak, would prefer a bad human than a good machine in this case. The other thing we found is that the differences are minor, as we had said, and this is interesting because this also matches, these minor differences match U.S. law. In the United States, the law, for example, says that you are not allowed to discriminate based on several demographic variables, and the Supreme Court, in ratifying this law, basically said that it is independent of intent. And this is what we found here. Here we find that people do have much more intent attributed to humans than to machines, but the judgments in many of these dimensions is similar. Chapter 4 that I'll be skipping speaks about privacy, but if you're interested in learning more about differential privacy and those kinds of things, you can look at Chapter 4 in the book, and the book is available for free online. And I will now move on to Chapter 5, which is about automating work. And the fears around automation are not new. For several years, there have been periods where there's been this fear where basically machines would be replacing most of the workforce. The last time that this happened in our recent history was in 1950, 1960 with the first artificial intelligence revolution, the age of the first perceptrons and when we start seeing these terms. But this also has happened in the past, for example, at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And in more recent times, these fears are emerging through a paper from about 2013 that predicted that roughly 50% of all jobs would be automated. But this paper from Frey Osborne really has been disaccredited recently because economic literature, at least on the matter, has several arguments and evidence showing that this idea that half of all jobs will be automated is a very rough estimate, and it is not exactly correct. On one hand, you have to understand that technology is not a substitute to labor, but instead a complement or supplement. It replaces certain tasks, but it also complements other tasks, and with that, productivity is increased as well as the aggregate demand, and it can in turn generate jobs. And secondly, I think this is the main error from the Frey Osborne paper, is that jobs are not automated. What is automated are tasks. And what happens is jobs are transformed with automation. They are not replaced fully or outright. One classic example in this literature are the ATMs in the United States. When the ATMs came out in the 80s, people thought that cashiers would go away. but the number of cashiers has actually gone up over time because automatic teller machines allow the banks to be in places where they could not be previously. So it has increased coverage for the banking system and thus increases the demand for ATMs. In China, for example, before COVID, it was very common to use QR codes to look at menus and even to make orders and pay the bill at restaurants. And that has not made waiters go away, but instead has transformed their role of bringing the food. They help to accommodate the children. They help the children to their, or the people to the tables, but they don't have to take your order and do everything else. So what's automated are the tasks, but the jobs are transformed where humans start to develop comparative skills in these other areas where machines are not involved. There's also no evidence that tech reduces the need for labor in the long run, or even in the short run. And maybe something that's even more reasonable is that the fear of technology might make work more precarious. And we see this, for example, today, where a lot of work has come out from technology. For example, deliveries have very precarious labor conditions and security in the work environments. And sometimes technology can take over that precarious work. And we look at the Industrial Revolution, much of the criticism and protest at the time wasn't so much about machines replacing work, because these factories in Manchester, for example, did hire many people at the time, but the working conditions were very poor. So it creates work, but it creates low-quality work, known as precarious work in the literature. Now, how do people react to automation that destroys or that eliminates human jobs, or other humans that replace other workers? Here we looked at automation pertaining to jobs being lost locally to foreigners. So, for example, a trucking company is seeking to reduce its costs and decides to bring in foreign workers, or decides to purchase self-driving trucks. A hotel chain wants to lower costs and decides to bring in robots that would serve as bartenders, make sandwiches, etc., or foreign workers to do the same job. The same for nuclear plants and a school. And what we see here in the case of the trucking company is this. We asked people, would you approve of this change? And when it involves foreigners, people do not approve it. But when it's about machines, it's more accepted. Would you ban this change? This question about banning is interesting because if this were democracy, this is what people would vote for. There's a significant difference. And in this case, they would ban foreigners, in this case, with almost 60%, but they would not ban machines. Is it morally correct to do this? They feel it's more morally incorrect to bring in foreigners than self-driving vehicles. Are the conditions improving or worsening when people bring in machines or foreigners? People believe that foreigners would be on the negative side of things here, and there would not be any similarity between the two. Now, when we look at the various scenarios, we see that the effect begins to reduce as we move through scenarios. It's very strong here when we look at the trucks. It's still here, but weaker so in the hotels. And when we talk about nuclear plants, the differences basically go away. This tells us suggestively that as we move on to industry or more sophisticated jobs, that's where people start to accept foreign talent more so than when it involves more simple jobs. Here in the schools, we also see very little effect, but here the scoring is much more negative than in the previous case. And this is because people do not want foreign professors, nor do they want robot professors. So they reject both, and hence this effect. Now, in this presentation, I did show you somewhat of a book, which is much longer, and that has many more scenarios. There's a lot more to be found there. There are many discussions and summaries of the literature. But here at the end, I'd like to show you a few statistics that will try and help us to gather all of these ideas together. So what I'll be doing first is bring in data from all these various scenarios, and I will put them on a three-dimensional plane, a three-dimensional cube, where we have how people judged human action, how they judged machine action, and I will connect these two dots with a line. And when I do that, I obtain this. And as you can see, all of the moral judgment falls on a certain plane, on a certain volume here. And that's interesting, but also somewhat obvious because there are certain corners that are forbidden. If somebody does something with a lot of intent that causes much harm, well, nobody says that that's good. So that obviously is normal. So the corners, those forbidden corners, delimit somewhat the possible or acceptable values, reasonable values. But even so, we see that there are many differences in how people judge humans and machines. So let's look at those differences. Let's look at the intent to cause harm. Here, what we see is that people assess the intent of machines quite differently from the intent of humans. The human intent is kind of bimodal. There's a lot of intent or little intent for humans, and machines are more unimodal. So if you look at it here, humans are considered to be more intentional than machines that carried out the same action, or less intentional. So we have this dual mode of judging humans. You were either guilty or it was the total accident, whereas machines, no. Machines are in this intent limbo. Then when we look at the intent and poor moral judgment, what we see here first is that there's a sort of a triangle. This is also somewhat obvious, and it's known in the literature that intent amplifies moral judgment. So if something is accidental, it can either be good or bad because the wrongness scale is divergent. When it's at 0, it's something good, and when you have a high value, it's bad. And 0.5 is neither good nor bad. But when there is little intent, what we see here, machines fare very poorly. In these accidents and these things where basically there is no agency, no intent, people assess the machine action as being worse than human action. In fact, oftentimes they assess human action as positive and machine action as negative. Lastly, when we look at harm and evil, what we see here is a very strong correlation but again, in scenarios where there is little harm, machines fare very poorly and are judged poorly. So let's move on and look at the mathematic modeling. Here, what we're going to try to do is create a very simple model where we will predict the moral judgment in saying how poorly or adequately people judge morality and as a function of the harm that is attributed to it. And we will do this differently for humans and for machines. We will have two different models that we will be comparing. And these models will be approximated with the first order, where we have a term for harm, a term for intent, a term for interaction between harm and intent, and then a set of vectors with a static effect. And what these vectors do is help us to control for any other characteristics between individuals, if they're men or women, if they're youth or older, and if they have different political affiliations, etc. So the control is done through here, and we will be focusing on the differences that we can observe with these other variables. We will then do the opposite. We will set the scenarios, we will have them static, and we'll see how individual demographies change the judgment. And this is the result. This is basically, as we can see in these two functions, well, we see that these two functions first are not parallel. If people judge machines worse than humans, then they would be parallel if it was equal treatment. But we do see that they are somewhat slanted. In this corner, for example, on the left-hand side, they are roughly equal. But here on the right-hand side, where the intent is very low and the harm is very high, we do see a gap, a very significant gap at almost 0.2 on a scale that goes from 0 to 1. And this rotation basically tells us that machines are being judged most of all on this harm dimension. The main cause is this dimension. So machines are judged by their results, and humans are judged by this diagonal line, which is this interaction term between intent and harm. So we see two different models, two moral philosophies that are different when judging machines and humans. Lastly, as I promised, we will see now how demographics affect scenarios. In the book, there's much more detail, but here, let's look at just one example. What we will do here is, for example, look at the question of whether you would replace a machine by human or a human for a machine. This is a general question that has a major difference in general, so it allows us to see the type of effect. Here, for example, when we look at the gender dimension, what do we see? Well, when we control the scenario and we see how the male or female genders affect judgments, we find that men are more likely to want to replace a human for a machine, and women are less likely to replace a human for a machine. In simple terms, men are more technophiles, more machinophiles. They like machines more. It might seem as though it's a stereotype, but that is the finding. And women are more human, have more of a human philia, where they prefer humans. And we see the same bias here when we have Asian participants as opposed to white, or as the education level goes up, there people become more machinophiles. So what we see here is that demographics do matter, but this has to be looked at with a very significant grain of salt, in that you have to look at the X values. If we assess the scenarios, we find differences of 0.2 on a scale of 0 to 1. Now we're seeing differences at 0.05. That is, these differences are statistically significant, but they are at 1, even sometimes 2 orders of magnitude lower than the differences between scenarios. So yes, there are differences at the education level, and gender and ethnicity, and there are even differences if people say they are affiliated religiously or not. But these differences do not change in general what we've seen before, but instead it modifies things somewhat because they have lower values. So they're just drops in a glass that if the volume where the volume of the glass changes, but it doesn't determine how full or how empty the glass is. So that's really important, because sometimes people tend to overinterpret these kinds of effects. And the fact that the effect is significant doesn't mean that it is the dominant effect when having a group of effects where they would all apply. So we began this presentation with a question. If a machine and a human make the same mistake, do we evaluate them in the same way, with the same reaction? And now we know that the answer is no, we react differently. We learned that we judge people by their intent, and the machines more by the results. We judge people also in a more bimodal way when we look at intent, and machines are left in this intent limbo, more of a unimodal manner. And there are consequences that come from these two correlations. For example, the fact that people judge humans by intent and machine by results, and that human results is seen more in a bimodal way, translates into people being able to pardon humans more so than machines in accidents. And people can also be a little bit more judgy of humans in scenarios involving fairness, as we saw, for example, in the algorithmic bias, or in the case where people would lose their jobs to foreigners or machines. People also found that there was much more harm in violent scenarios. We saw a few scenarios that did involve violence, such as the self-driving vehicle or the accident. And in the book, we have a few more that involve police violence and everything else. And lastly, when machines do things well, they don't take as much credit. People take it as a matter of fact. So when machines do things well, when technology is well done, it does not receive as much credit as it should when compared to humans that would have done the same. This book was also published through MIT Press, and we worked with artists to illustrate them and to make it a lively book, a book that you can keep at home in your living room. And it could also be the start of a conversation, because there are many scenarios there that lead you to imagine many different things. And the book is also available in a series of 30 videos on the Center for Collective Learning on YouTube. This goes into more detail. There are 30 videos, 7 minutes each approximately. And if you're interested in, for example, teaching this book with an online format, you can use this material freely in your programs and anything else. Lastly, I'd like to thank all of you. The book is available at judgingmachines.com. You can have the full download there. Or if you'd like to have a printed version, you can buy from MIT Press on Amazon or other online bookstores. And with that, I'd like to thank Paola, Maria Jose, and everyone else. And I'm happy to speak with you about any questions or comments you might have. Thank you. Thank you so much, César. Very, very interesting. When you were speaking, I was reminded that with the pandemic, I bought a robot machine vacuum cleaner, and now I'm actually feeling love for it. So in addition to criteria, you also create feelings. But anyway, that's a separate subject. Let's move on to the audience questions. And the first question we have is, what led to this research? What drives you? Why are you doing this? Why is it important?
La razón por la que es importante es la
Well, the reason why it's important is this. We as people, as societies, we must always make decisions. And there are important decisions, for example, in adopting technology or not. And that's a decision that can vary in different fields. It might be a public decision with using certain technology in public policy, and then in hospitals for diagnostics, or maybe in a factory where a new management system for warehouses is being used. When we have this decision to adopt, we have to ask ourselves if we're making the decision fairly. Because, for example, we know that we are very critical of machines in situations where we do things fairly, and we can lose the opportunity of adopting technology that ultimately is positive. And the opposite can happen as well. We're not very critical of machines in situations where machines make mistakes. We can adopt machines there in situations where situations might be harmful. So basically, if we don't do this research, we would not have a way of knowing if we are adopting technology responsibly or not. We don't know if our decisions are being fair or not. And that takes us on this path where we have to ask ourselves, okay, if we're criticizing technology in this situation, well, we have to look at our own bias, because the machines, we're happy to criticize machines, but we're not perfect. And I think that the entire system does require that understanding, the understanding of how we are biased and how we might take or make better decisions with that in mind. That is true. We do have a bias, and a very strong bias with machines. I ask myself, what might happen if a self-driving vehicle were to run over a person? How would that be judged? That's a very broad subject, and we know that we will coexist. We already coexist with machines, increasingly so. Going on to the next question. On a more personal level, in what cases would you choose a machine over a human? Well, there are several cases. For example, maybe the simplest I could describe are, for example, cases
inversión en mercado financiero.
Cases of investing in the financial markets.
Que, por ejemplo, si tú
Experiments have been done where, for example, if you have a machine that makes investment decisions for you, let's say an automated algorithmic fund, or a person that is leading that fund, an actual manager, a fund administrator, and we have different rates. For example, the return rate for the algorithm is better than in humans. But if I show you the investments that were made and I show you where each made a mistake, people still prefer the human because they tend to overinterpret the fact that they think that they didn't make a mistake despite the algorithm doing better on average. So there are situations where you have an algorithm that has a return rate that is slightly better In a financial market, the difference of having a 7% difference and an 8% difference is huge over time. These are significant amounts of money. So there are situations where you do want to be pragmatic, where you would have algorithms. And then there are situations, for example, that might involve security protocols where machines can have much better security performance. And that doesn't mean that performance will be zero, but the accident rate would go down by a significant degree. So it's important to talk about that decision of using and improving machines and not be alarmist anytime there's a mistake made, because you might be backtracking to a system that causes even more harm. So there are situations where I think you can be pragmatic and think that a machine can do significant work in a team. In the end, it's always this context of a team, people working with machines somehow or another. And César, from the pandemic point of view, as it pertains to machines, do you think that this pandemic has caused, has made it so that conditions are more favorable to machines, or it has been a neutral impact? What is your take? Well, that's difficult because I haven't researched it really. And anecdotally, you do see cases that have come up. On one hand, I think the pandemic did expedite communication, digital communication at least. Having online events in 2019, nobody wanted to go to a webinar, but today it's been a year and a half that's all we've been doing. So I think there were transformations in that regard that were quite strong, and that also lead people to understand that maybe the digital presence, a well-done website, proper data distribution, that does have a significant value. It isn't just something nice to have. In fact, in the field in which I work in the private sector with my company, I see now that people are using data distribution and taking it more seriously, and not something that's just nice to have, but instead that it's something that must be done right and that it must work for many years into the future. Because we've seen also through the pandemic that the data distribution and data analysis systems in governments and really in the entire world were quite precarious in many cases. And that's an issue that we found everywhere. And that's why we have, for example, the data repository for the pandemic is done at Oxford, because no government agency was able to do what a very small group of people was able to do in that same field. So I think that's what we're seeing. But also, conversely, we have also entered into a world where, through the information we share on social networks and all that, there are many people who are quite skeptical of technology. And this technology, be it artificial intelligence or be it vaccines, there's a certain correlation in being skeptical with technology. That's what I can glean. For example, people who are against the vaccine are likely against the artificial intelligence, against automation, against algorithmic decision making. And I think there's that space also that has grown in certain people under this context. So what is the net effect? The net effect might not be that support went up or down, but instead became more polarized. It became something that is increasingly more important and therefore more polarizing. Before, it was like this issue that was for the technologists, for academics, but today it's an issue that is much more commonplace and maybe more polarizing than it was 2 years ago. Very interesting to see the effects of the pandemic. In fact, I was also seeing this yesterday in the report on education, where before we would have a prejudice against online education, and now today we see that it's a true opportunity and is improving every day. To close out the questions, a very specific question came in here from the audience, and it is, how many people participated in this survey? How much time did this process take to come to these conclusions? Well, there's two answers there. One, we had those who took the survey, and then we had those who worked on my team. Those who took the survey, it was upwards of 6,000 people. And why so many people? Well, because basically when you do these studies, this is social psychology, and I did this with two postdocs and two psychologists, Diana and Philippa, and
¿Qué quiere decir que se
what we wanted to avoid was having the sample become contaminated. What does this mean? It means that one group of people is presented a scenario with humans. That person, the group of people, cannot see that same scenario with a machine. Or if I show a certain scenario, I can't show a similar scenario to the same group of people because those two scenarios might also interact in these people's minds. So what we have to do is take these scenarios independently. If I recall, there were 89 scenarios, and divide them into groups. And basically what we do then is create a batch of 10 scenarios with certain conditions, some machine or human, and then each of them would go to another group, to a certain group of people. And in total, that led us to interact with 6,000 different people that we recruited to the study. This was just in the US, so the applicability is for within the United States. That's the scope of the study. But as we see that demographics are of a second order, we've already reproduced some of the results in Europe. And I think one of the main conclusions really talk more about human psychology, where there's more universality. And then there are other things that are more minor that might depend more on demographics or local culture. Thank you very much, César. And just to conclude, you know that this conference is for an initiative led by RedCLARA. RedCLARA is the network that connects networks such as REUNA or the National Research Network in Brazil or in Ecuador for higher education. What would be your thought on this for this community on your for your analysis? Well, my thoughts are there's a lot of room forward here. If you look at the book and the material, it's extremely simple. What it does is compare how humans judge machines as opposed to humans doing the same action. And this book, well, we were able to publish it with a peer review under MIT Press, and it does have certain components to it, but it's really the start of the road because there's more fruit beneath this tree. When starting to compare humans and machines with something as simple as this, that tells us that there are many questions beyond this that we can ask in my group and in other groups. In fact, those other questions are starting to be addressed and are being experimented on to go further. So I think that this is a good time. I mean, if you have any questions on the effects or on the differences or on things that you'd like to see that you did not see today that are not in the book and not in the literature, I think it's a great moment if you are studying a doctorate degree, if you are in a master's program, or if you are leading research. It's a good time to come in and participate because this is a field where we will have much to investigate and discover. And that's why I think that for a network such as this is a great path to undertake to continue forward. Thank you very much, César. It's a pleasure to have had you here. Thank you for having taken this time, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, Paola. Thank you, Mar Jose, and thanks to everyone for having attended this morning. And, well, it was a great pleasure for me to share this time with you and the team. I wish you the best of luck in the rest of the conference. Thank you very much. Be well. Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, we will now go back to our second guest for today's closing session at TICAL2021. And it would be Dr. Francesc Pedró. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, right? Francesc? And Francesc has been the director for higher education at UNESCO for Latin America and the Caribbean. He previously led the advisory service on education policy, leading national policy, and shared and international cooperative studies in the field of education at UNESCO in Paris. He previously worked at the Research Center at the Innovation and Research Center at the OCDE, where as a senior political analyst was responsible for projects such as Teaching and Learning International Survey, the New Millennium Learning Project, and also led education reviews in OCDE countries and the project on a systemic project on education. Francesc was born in Barcelona, beautiful city. I did have a chance to visit your city, and I want to go back as soon as we are freed up. He graduated from Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and subsequently did his postdoctoral studies on public policy at the London University in the UK. I'll leave you now with Francesc to talk also about artificial intelligence, but now in higher education. What is its impact, what opportunities there are, and also to reflect on what's been happening this last year of the pandemic and what the impacts have been there, as well as what opportunities there have been for higher education. Go ahead, Francesc. Thank you very much. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to engage in this event for this magnificent network. I know that most of the specialists or most of the participants here are specialized in technology, and my perspective, despite my content centering on artificial intelligence, will be more of a perspective, the perspective of an observer outside of technology, but that is at least trying to see what opportunities there are, and in turn, what needs there are under the pandemic, and now looking towards the post-pandemic and how artificial intelligence can help us. So if I may, I will share my presentation.
En primer lugar, quisiera empezar.
So first, I'd like to begin by reminding everyone at what point we are when it comes to higher education, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would quickly describe it today to use to address this technological audience. I would say that there's a triple disconnect. The first disconnect is widely known by the participants, and it has to do with the issue that comes up when we realize that higher education pivots really on connectivity. Only 51% of households in our region have the equipment and connectivity needed to, for example, participate in an event such as this. You might say that in the case of students of higher education, they might be somewhat different because if there's any community that is connected, it is the youth, and that is true. But let's not forget that when speaking of higher education in our region, that a significant part, fortunately, of our students are from lower socioeconomic strata. And the paradox is that they have better connectivity in university facilities when they went in person than they do at home. And conversely, this graphic also shows us that we have far surpassed we have gone far past the past, where if students have anything, it is a mobile device in their pockets. And this and when in person, they have larger screens and better equipment. Logically, connectivity is not necessarily very high, and some of the most vulnerable students comprise some of these large data groups. But looking into the future, other crises will come up, And we must look at the universality of this device, where we must consider certain aspects. It's really important to highlight the efforts of those who are in this meeting today, who have made it so that many universities have done everything possible to take equipment to the students that did not have it, oftentimes with the support of governments themselves, to have data packages or even SIM cards reach this population to reduce that technological bias. But it is a risk, and it's a risk that is not homogeneously distributed through students, but instead more strongly affects the most vulnerable students, especially those who are the first generation in their families to access higher education. This is from a study we did at UNESCO, showing what happens when we compare higher education students in Latin America and it shows us that the students on the left-hand side are suffering less from the from the effects of confinement, given that we are more social than maybe other parts of the world. However, if you look at the third column, the third group of columns, you will see that they have greater difficulty in keeping regular schedules. The third group of columns from right to left. And what this refers to is simply the capacity of self-moderation in education. And that's where another issue lies. It's not that students have difficulties in coming in on time, but instead they have difficulties in surviving in a context where the educators are not constantly announcing what is happening every half hour, every hour, but instead they are left to make their own decisions. And this is because connectivity peaks when connecting to university happen not during the day, which is supposedly when the students would be studying remotely, but as of 6 p.m., that is when the day is over, and the students maybe remember that they had to connect to the platform. So I think that this inability to self-regulate in education says a lot and doesn't say many good things about our school systems that creates future university students that are extremely dependent instead of providing for their autonomy and in turn learning for learning. The last one is more about the technological disconnect that derives into social emotional effects. With this UNESCO data, we know that 70% of students right now say that they are suffering stressful situations and that are not specifically in shape from the social emotional standpoint. And then 1/3 of them say that they have had episodes associated with extreme anxiety, in certain cases needing medical or psychological intervention. In this field, universities are doing everything possible as well to offer support mechanisms that are difficult to have remotely, but universities are truly responding as communities that are concerned, particularly for their students, although also, of course, for their professors and technical personnel. The second disconnect, and that was the second disconnect, and the third disconnect is how much time do you think students are able to stay in front of a screen at a computer looking at something similar to this event? Empirical research tells us that it is 20 minutes. However, we have spent months basically in trying to simulate the same schedules that we had at universities, but in the online format, demanding that sessions should be 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours long, where the pedagogical value may be lost, and at least not as attractive. And here, obviously, universities have learned their lessons, and you can say that after the first 6 to 9 months, they have since then tried to support the students to take full advantages of the channel and the context in which they're in, which is a re-engineering of education in their courses. In fact, in many cases, professors have had to discover or have had to resort, rather, to pedagogical engineering in their courses because the classes were suffering. And having class is not synonymous to graduating, as the data shows. So there are three disconnects that lead to the effects that unfortunately are devastating. The first being that with our estimates, we believe that there will be, well, if we were to go back to the classrooms today and look at where students are today, looking at other similar crises, and what happens with the loss in skills, the loss in proficiency with large absences from education, shows us that if we were to go back to the classrooms, about 14% of skills have been lost, especially when compared to students who were at that same point in that same program 1 year prior. This data is important because it means that universities are doing everything possible to create mechanisms to recover these scores once they go back to the classroom. And I know that it's difficult to accept, it's difficult to program, but without that additional effort, we could say that not only skills are being lost, but very likely there will be long-term effects. And those students would also, in turn, have lower incomes. The second loss that I think is quite notable is the loss of students. As I've tried to show, with these disconnects, they can lead to students, especially the most vulnerable students, it can lead to them not coming back to the classrooms. In fact, many of them are no longer there connected. They're no longer connected. The estimate is that the losses at universities in countries and under programs are upwards of 3 to 10%. Again, having to relearn how classrooms go. In this relearning, we are not yet sure how long this effect would last. It might be useful to use what happened already in the last academic course in the United States, where we do see a high attrition rate with some of the most serious student losses that have ever been seen in public institutions in their short-term programs. That target students that are typically of lower and middle incomes, whereas in prestigious schools, for-profit schools, with long-term projects and attractive projects for that population, they saw an increase in demand. And I think this is paradoxical, but undoubtedly it does show something that we've always known, and that is that under these crises, the way out is positive for some and more negative for others. The have and the have-nots do have broad differences here. The loss of students and then loss of equity. Clearly, as I just described, we have found situations where our Gaussian curves describing the gap between the most capable and the least capable students will flatten, and we will surely find significant effects in these groups of students. I've been summarizing the effects on these socioeconomic variables, but I think that in our region, it's important to also consider the importance of the sex variable has, because we perfectly know that there are many more women who used to dominate university classrooms. There were many more women who will not be coming back for the simple reason that by going back home, they were once again captured by archaic family structures that use them as mechanisms to survive in a family economy, or even to provide services within the family at the cost of interrupting their studies. That is the case of women, and there we see a significant effect also in the academic offering when it comes to research. There are many studies that are showing that productivity in academic women have drastically dropped under the pandemic, or at least more so than their male counterparts. Obviously, for UNESCO, this is scandalous, and I cannot overemphasize this. In this context, we see variables such as race, economic situation, and even sex, as we see in these charts from the United States, are quite significant. So the question is, okay, so does all this maybe also, just as with any crisis, does this also create anything positive? There is, for example, an opportunity for digital transformation. And if there were none, what role could the digital play for university educators in Latin America, namely artificial intelligence? Well, let's look at it. I'll be describing three typical situations. One, taken from the New York Times, and this is from our colleagues at the IDB who brought us this report. This is a typical case of something that's been happening, of a mother, a young mother, 30 years old, who will not be going back to her studies. So she is a dropout. The second is Juan, who is a typical student who will not be going back because, first of all, he is totally disconnected. Not only disconnected technologically, but also in terms of not feeling they belong to the learning community, because the proposition seems to him to be unacceptable. The third, well, I mentioned initially that when we go back to the classrooms, it might be necessary to not resume the programs as we left them, but instead to do everything possible to see at where each student is, and then offer each of them what they need to level their skills. So dropout, disconnect, recovery. And I think that these are three issues that we're seeing today where, curiously enough, it makes me think that by having mechanisms that use artificial intelligence, we would likely have to at least have a clear diagnostic on what the situation is, and we could even predict certain risk situations. Thanks to artificial intelligence, we are able to now, as Maxima Marxista said, we can now see people based on their needs. So that's the theory, and for that, and we have these three issues. There are likely more. So again, dropout, disconnect, and the need to recover, for which learning metric-based solutions based on artificial intelligence could provide an opportunity. So allow me to, now that I've talked about the issues, let's talk about the realities. The realities about things that are happening today. And in fact, this will allow me to show you a visit that I made to a prestigious university, a state university, of course, in Beijing, in China. This was 2.5 years ago now, almost. So I'll be showing you several things that I saw. First, I went to the university cafeteria. If you don't know, there, the usual thing is to not have your usual lunch, as we do in other cultures, but instead to use several small, it's like tapas, several small dishes all together. So the students do not have to write down what they will eat anywhere, nor do they have to go through the register once they're done. They have a system that identifies them when they come into the cafeteria, and it also identifies what they're eating and how much. And in the end, when they leave the cafeteria, they receive a little ding on their cell phones saying that they have been charged for the meal. And the next day, before coming in to the cafeteria, they will have an indicator. They will have a menu for those smaller dishes ready based on their previous experience, or even recommendations to explore new flavors that the system detects that they have never had. So you might say, well, this is quite interesting, and it wouldn't cost much to have this at our university. That's fine. But I think that in reality, there is very little value added to education itself. What else does this university offer? Well, there's also a system that is extremely interesting that tries to measure the degree of attention being paid by students in class and correlate that with their final exam performance. Obviously, what this system does is reach conclusions about whether or not the low scores were associated with the lack of attention when attending class. Or it could also identify other issues in students when, despite having paid attention, their performance in the final exams was poor. And as you might imagine, when students are aware of the fact that they will be recorded and monitored in terms of their attention span, they do everything possible to keep their eyes always open and steady on the blackboard. And I can just tell you what I saw. That doesn't mean that I think that this is a practice that it might be recommendable. In fact, in the university world where I was raised, and even in the world where I was a professor, we allow for the students to have free will. They will either show up to class or not, and they will not be penalized for that. We celebrate that, however, that there are students that have good grades despite not having attended our classes, because that means that what we are explaining in class might be redundant or for things they already know. So in our culture, this would not be acceptable. And given our stance around quality education, I am sure that this would not fly here. But you might agree with me that it wouldn't be bad at all to have all the students pay more attention. And I'm saying this jokingly, even if it's 100% fake, as they say now. Maybe more interesting is the third element, which was a small English class where a television screen, a huge screen, welcomed us, this group of 6 foreign visitors. This young lady is 100% artificial. She was an agent, as they call her, a virtual agent, and as we would call her in technology. She welcomed us and asked that we take a seat. And for class, they asked that we identify ourselves. And then the first exercise began, which was repeating a phrase that you might know very well, which is something like, my father is available. And I think just with that one phrase, this young lady was able to identify each of us with our accents and other variables. And as the exercises started, the virtual assistant would call out the attendees that that it considered had the best accent. So, for example, she would say, Jonas, repeat after me. And then the other students would hear his accent. When trying to show an example of poor pronunciation, they would say, Francesc, please repeat after me. And I would say my English phrase, and of course that is not how it should be said. So anyway, I found this to be extremely interesting, despite it being a children's game. But it was interesting because it made me remember that sentence from the science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke that said something like, if an educator can be substituted for a machine, it's because they deserve it. And I think that we have reached that point where certain activities that are typical of educators would seem to be, at least in my experience, capable of being covered by very expensive systems, of course, but in the end, recoverable using artificial intelligence. So you start to ask yourself, well, if these kinds of routines can be done, and allow me to say, put it in these terms, by this machine, then what would an educator do? I'll leave that for later, but the experiences that I had point to this. You might have other and more interesting experiences. We're not so much concerned about this. We're so concerned about this matter that we tried to address this consensus in Beijing for education that I am also mentioning to you to see how far we were able to go. It was not easy, politically speaking, because as you might imagine, there are very different perspectives there. China has a political backing for using artificial intelligence as opposed to Norway or other countries. But anyway, I encourage you to also take this survey. In reality, I would think that if we had to take discussion further beyond experiences, I would think, and you might agree with me, that in reality, we can apply artificial intelligence, or at least its theory, to any profession, particularly in education, where decision-making takes place, or at least basic information for decision-making. This is a whole portfolio of countless tasks that I would even say unconsciously professors carry out, where logically artificial intelligence would have the potential to help with. Either way, let me go from these experiences and these basic principles where algorithms help us with certain tasks to reality. This isn't what I would like, but this is what is happening. And in this case, I would say that it's important to remember that the use of these technologies by higher education institutions, particularly in the United States, which is the country of reference here, is still quite incipient. Let's look at the comparison then between 2017 and 2018, where you will see that institutions are only at 18% throughout the US that use courseware, that is applications tied to platforms to provide content, be they PDF files or others, and despite our view is still quite low. But anything having to do with adaptive technologies, that is where the results of a diagnostic must be applied together with a course of action, that is at 10%. So I think that this is the reality in one of the countries that is supposedly leading this process. And this also leads us to reflect on applied research. This is the results of a meta-analysis that was done in 2019 about rigorous studies, empirical studies, on artificial intelligence applications in education. Since 2007 to 2019 and a half, roughly, mid-2019, 146 articles were published in international magazines that might be considered to be based on empirical approximations. 146 out of throughout 12 years, roughly. And look at the fields, the basic fields in which these articles have been written. On one hand, There is the student profiling on it,
del abandono. Recientemente,
on matters having to do with admissions and dropouts. I recently went to an Argentinian university showing how, as a private university, showing how marketing for that university was also based on student segmentation that was in turn based on a very simple but effective application of artificial intelligence. And then the second group, which is also in this diagnostic, has to do with assessments and testing, which has much to do with our capacity to offer a personalized education that considers each student's gaps and pace, as well as their interest. These are the main fields, again, the profiling, where, again, the profiling is the strongest when it comes to the economic and financial point of view for at least most of the education institutions that I know of. But again, it's surprising that in 12 years of research, there are only less than 150 articles. And we also know that in higher education institutions in the US, they are the ones that have some of the most information. And when asked what their outlook is for the use of artificial intelligence in the next 5 years, the outlook changes in the sense that the use by professors is still relatively low, only at 1/3, whereas applying artificial intelligence in management does allow for improved management for academic and financial programs in managing resources and human resources. I think this is very symptomatic. And to what point the use of technology is as widespread in using artificial intelligence in university management. And then there's another world where, as of the pandemic, has been quite reluctant to use technology, and that is in the teaching world, of course, with many exceptions. And we still have yet to see what will happen now when everyone universally who is in this experiment, when everyone in this experiment would use technology under the pandemic. So, like it or not, what is true is that we can expect more artificial intelligence developments in education and in teaching. What requirements then are needed or are there to look at the case where a dean or a professor or a program director would have a dashboard like this where they can see exactly what is happening in a certain course, in a certain classroom. To get to this point, we need to very likely have three things, very simple things. The first, of course, is that there be a platform that isn't just about management, but in a comprehensive platform where management addresses the teaching processes as such. That is, ideally, anything happening at the university, from content sharing to student matters, problem solving, testing, but also collections, payroll, academic records, files, etc. They must all be connected through a single platform. There is an increasing number of universities that have this. Logically, that platform would create countless data. More data, of course, well, maybe I haven't expressed myself correctly. Unfortunately, I should say, this is still not enough data around education and learning, because the use in this field is still in the minority. Or rather, the way platforms are being used are simply to contain content, but does not address the actual education activity in students. So one platform that creates data, and then on top of this data, that is where we would find those layers of algorithms and those layers of artificial intelligence that in principle would facilitate our lives, make our lives easier. In the case of educators, and I'll close with this, what is true is that this transition has been extremely difficult. What is attractive in these dashboards for managers is not interesting at all for the educators themselves. Why? Because it reminds them in the end that they are also knowledge managers and not just informers. We see what's been happening with the pandemic under UNESCO data, and when comparing Hispanic America with the rest of the world, we see that typically the applications most being used are applications that mimic typical classroom sessions where there is a professor conveying knowledge and students receiving. Our data also shows that in very little time, universities have been using applications such as Zoom that they're using Zoom and now using more complex applications such as Moodle, where you can find a value proposition that is more centered on learning activities. So why is this so difficult? Well, because we might have the solution before the question, and this is what happens with university professors in general, as well as with school teachers. In reality, in order to achieve maximum adoption by professors, we must be able to convince them of two things. The first is that it's easy to use these systems. In fact, I've seen some applications developed at universities that are quite interesting, but are not, as they say, user-friendly. Or they might not be yet at that point, maybe over time. But if you don't present things in a very friendly way, well, then you still have that rejection. So ease of use is one thing, and the learning curve to gain the benefits has to be low, and we're not there yet. And secondly, we have to be able to provide the professors with skills to use the platforms. It's one thing to say, look, this is going to be somewhat difficult to learn, but once you learn it, you'll be much more efficient and students will learn more and in a better way. That we have not been able to achieve either. That is, we are at a stage now where people are still trying to overcome that barrier because we have not been able to convince people. People are actually fearful. And why risk your life? I mean, if you're a professor and when you find a student out in the streets in your hometown and they smile back at you, that means that, you know, you're not being threatened. So you got to smile back. That means, you know, that at least things are working out well. So why would I even undertake this demanding adventure? What incentives are there in using these services? What can I gain from this? I think that is the mindset, and not the mindsets of others saying, I have the solution, this is the solution. No, I prefer you put yourself in my shoes and say, what will work for me in the classroom, given that I'm a professor and not of any other profession. So I have to address different issues in a classroom. And it's also true that professors tend to trust very much in their own skills. And we have created this predominant culture that, for better or for worse, is anti-commercial, pro-free, and self-sufficient. That is, we are reluctant in saying the materials there has been developed by another professor. Well, yes, that's right, but I will be doing things somewhat differently. And if I have to pay for copyright, no. Then I'll just download it from the internet and that's it. Well, that's the culture that we have been creating amongst all of us that makes us more favorable to open source. But the difference between open and free is still very blurry. It's a blurred line. I'm really grateful to the efforts being made at many universities so that professors understand the limits of copyrights and also the opportunities that lie therein. I think that is really important. It's really important to break down this idea and instead have a respectful intellectual and collective education environment that can be had through open source instead of taking our shortcuts online. But again, that is the current case. So I'll close with that. And I apologize because, again, I am not a technologist. So what is the secret to success in this adoption and in this transition, in this window of opportunity that is positive ultimately? Well, I would say just two things, just to leave some time for questions. The first is that we must explain to our professors the Hans Christian Andersen story, that story of the emperor who is convinced by two fraudsters that they will make a suit with a material that is so fine that only smart people can see it. So they take the money and they convince the emperor ultimately to walk naked through the streets. And no one says anything because of that caveat until a child in their innocence screams, "The emperor is naked." And I think that what the pandemic has shown us is that the emperors, the respective emperors in each country, our academics, our professors, were basically walking around naked. That is this logic where to be a great researcher means that you've posted many papers and therefore you are a great educator. That has to be done away with because that is not true. It is true that for every 100 researchers, there is likely one that can communicate fantastically. But the learning processes are processes that must be addressed with a deep knowledge, psychology even, and an education as such. And you don't learn this with a doctorate program. You learn it by applying. These are skills that universities must seek to develop in their professors. We all know that when it comes to those skills, educators are more open to those kinds of learnings if it will lead to the success of other professors. It doesn't do me any good to learn that in X university in Northern Europe, they are doing a certain thing. That might be illustrative, it might be inspirational, but if what I want to do is redo pedagogical engineering for my own program, supposing I have one, well, it's more useful instead to ask my colleague, who apparently is recognized as a great instructor, as to how to proceed. And it's that structure that I believe universities must contribute to implementing. It's great to have that technical standpoint, but we cannot explain to educators that don't know anything. I mean, we can tell them that they are naked, but there are some that at least have underwear on. And there are some that actually are very well dressed, and we have to learn from them. And they are already in our universities. So let's make an effort to recognize that talent and know that it's there. And let's, in turn, create career incentives for our educators where we acknowledge that being a good educator brings rewards. And that will be accepted in any country that I know of. And now the paradox is that university professors, as opposed to primary middle school teachers, are ultimately researchers. But curiously enough, they do not look at empirical research as much as they should. And I think that that is also an extremely important lesson. We need our educators to not only prove what things are possible to do at their institutions, but must also show the evidence of what is working right and not. So I would say that any attempt to promote artificial intelligence in learning and teaching processes must gradually try and gain the interest of the professors that are usually at the cutting edge and that have a significant influence over other educators. And we must also generate the evidence showing how these applications and how this re-engineering can translate into better education as a whole. I think that any academic cannot ignore the evidence. The issue is that we don't seem to be very much interested in showing that. Therefore, I would say that with artificial intelligence, we must convince professors that it is imperative to go one step further and that they must be supported in universities, not expecting external talent, but creating capacity within the institutions. And evidence must be generated, if possible, local evidence, which I think has a greater value. It's better to know that in a certain course, my colleague is given X thing happened because we introduced these changes or this variables, instead of learning about what's been happening on the other side of the world in a different continent. And lastly, I would say that it's really important to ethically rearm yourself. There's a saying around that in that Chinese experience that I showed you. In that university visit, we saw how educators seriously reflect on the ethical use of these kinds of technologies, which might stop being as positive and might become invasive. I think that there we must recall ultimately that learning processes are part of a broader transformation that we offer students at universities. Learning is very important, but we also undergo a transformative process that is extremely educational and human fundamentally. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't bore you too much or tell you things you already knew. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Francesc. Very moving, your presentation. In fact, you made me remember what I have had to experience as a mother in some of these institutions where children, well, they're not as children anymore. Mine are both in college. And I can't imagine those professors that don't even turn on the camera these days. I mean, you work on a screen, you see all the students, and now there are professors that don't even turn on the camera. They end the class and leave, and there are several people that, you know, it might seem they were there, but they were never actually there. So if it was already difficult to maintain the students' attention, I remember years ago when I was at university, I was sitting in the back row, and sometimes I would sometimes get lost. So I can't imagine in this new context and this disruption, using technology in the classroom, it But I can see where the rejection might be for educators. In Chile, in fact, as of March of 2020, when the pandemic began, over 80% of the Chilean students had never taken a remote class, which means that professors hadn't given remote classes. The following month, everyone had to work that out. So it's been a tremendous challenge for everyone, for professors, for educators, for students, for parents who are at home all day now all of a sudden. I think that really has brought many challenges, but also many opportunities. So let me go on to the questions. You were saying in one of those charts that one of the impacts of the pandemic will be that lag, that loss. And how do you think that this might be reverted? The consequences of the pandemic reverted using artificial intelligence, or what kind of action should be taken by universities to minimize the costs of the COVID effect? Yeah, that's a difficult answer because I think artificial intelligence, or at least certain applications, could have helped and should have been installed to prevent dropouts and disconnects. Now, it's too late for that. At this point, the losses have been had. So I think that maybe where we would have to emphasize further is in the use of certain applications in terms of not only testing and diagnosing skills, but also looking at where the students are as far as their skills once they come back to university. And we must go even beyond that and take it to a second level where we also try and see how certain applications can propose activities to level the students and recover them. We'd have to see what is used in each country, but the idea is that very likely the students will come in with a lag and with greater differences as far as skills than they would have been had they remained in an in-person context. So for me, these applications would, again, have to be focused on diagnosing and even and with a good diagnostic, evidence-based diagnostics, there could be awareness as to the shortcomings and the flaws in each student. And secondly, if we could go beyond that and provide customized solutions. The issue is that these are not solutions you could buy off the shelf. When you want to know how to cut glass, you can find it online. But in this case, we don't have those kinds of applications or examples. What we must do is invest in developing these kinds of applications and create content. There are certain universities in Latin America that have been smart enough so as to record most of the classroom sessions that have been given, and many of them, not all of them, but many of them, can be reincorporated into distance learning. I think that that is the good news. But truth be told, the effort needed so that those applications are motivating and that raise interest in students, that entails a significant investment, at least in time. We'll see about money, but at least in time. So therefore, I don't think that there is a ready-made solution, unfortunately. Yes, that is true. And it's also true that there is much data that has come from the pandemic. And I don't know what kind of analysis is being done, but between online work, screen time, there's a lot of information on that. Maybe their artificial intelligence could also step in, like you're saying, because it does require data. And today we do have significant amounts of data. I don't know if it's all in the hands of universities. I don't know if it's in the hands of major conglomerates like Google. surely they are already doing artificial intelligence with all this data. So undoubtedly, there's an opportunity there to continue to work into the future. And it's not easy and it's not for everyone. Now, one thing that comes to me specifically that I've seen is that thanks to the pandemic, it's not normalized is not the word, but it's the acceptance of technology. Agreeing to attend a webinar is now more commonplace in universities, even with former students. There's been great progress there in establishing those kinds of relationships. Do you envision any kind of opportunity going back to that gap? Any opportunity for continuous education at universities now with this change in mindsets that the pandemic has brought? Yes, of course. One of the main opportunities, and we might have to talk about this on another occasion because there's a lot to say about the use of technology and artificial intelligence, but one of the things that is happening is that people who for many years left college and are now parents, for example, are now seeing that distance learning in general through technology is no longer as unthinkable, but instead it has become a true resource for permanent education, what they are now calling upscaling. So I think that having all of the population, or at least students and their families, having had that intense contact with technology, that now means that distance learning will no longer be strictly for postgraduate studies, but instead a secondary solution that will likely become the core of university offerings. And I think that's extremely interesting. And it also matches with something that's already been happening even before the pandemic. And it is that the number of students, the number of university students that use distance learning, even in undergraduate studies, has not stopped growing. In Brazil, for example, it's practically 1/3 of university students currently who are in distance learning. I personally, at UNESCO, we say that distance learning is not a universal solution for undergraduate studies, because we do believe that going through college isn't just an opportunity for developing academic skills that later provide market value, but it is also a step in the maturity of the students. But distance learning has huge potential in this region particularly to raise the level of our professionals. And I think now what we've seen is that universities have acquired the capital and the machines and the servers and many educators with the experience needed so as to now begin offering programs to cover that need. Yes, especially when thinking of what we were saying in the previous session, that machines and robots are here to stay, and we have to perfect ourselves now to stay ahead. We are almost out of time, so I will go on to one final question that I think is extremely important as well. When it comes to dropouts, attrition, the loss of students, especially the women, as you mentioned in your presentation. All this comes together with a session and a conversation that we had on women online and opportunities. So if there is already a gap, this can increase the gap. So the question is, who are the main stakeholders that can motivate or can affect dropout rates, especially in women? Well, in general, I would say that we're already seeing this. The leaders themselves at education institutions, they play a significant role in that. And I think that this is where a clear line is drawn between universities with universities with that run a business and universities that want to become an alma mater. Hence the origin of the name in Latin, actually, what they seek is a shared universe. There is a responsibility to provide care in a broader sense of the word as a university. And I think we've seen university leaders that have gone and sought out their students to see where they are. And I mean each and every student. I'm not saying that deans are doing this, but the devices are there, the resources are there to send the message now saying we are here and we care about you. I think that is extremely interesting. And then secondly, I would say that leveling efforts will be extremely critical. In fact, some universities are already offering those remediation activities, which are so needed in fields where education might have failed, and in other fields where this will not be possible until we get back to the classrooms. And that would be absolutely necessary in the broadest of terms. It's really, I mean, it will cost us. This is going to cost money, it's going to cost resources, and that is where I think that governments must provide supports. I always am reminded that there's a very significant role in higher education institutions, at least in theory, in the stimulus plans and other efforts that must go together with the crisis recovery. And if it's not there, well, then it's because the universities were not explained very well about the roles that universities play in recovering from crises through education, as we're seeing now, together with mechanisms to look at social cohesion. We have to remind ourselves of this, and it is in the stimulus plans and recovery plans, and of course, in those plans, these variables must be considered to be all as important. I've been somewhat selfish, so to speak, because I've been looking at things exclusively from the standpoint of universities. But in general, the damage around gender differences has been expanded by the pandemic. So I would say that one of the cross-cutting themes in addressing this would include even social investments so that women do regain the position they had before the pandemic, which wasn't exactly good either, but at least we should do as much as possible to get to that point. I think that the recovery plans that are underway are focusing mostly on economic recovery and well-being, but we have to go further and ask ourselves, to what point is the recovery and leaving a crisis, is there also a social and gender effect? And in that sense, I would emphasize that universities are not only part of the question, but we're also part of the answer. Thank you, Francesc, for this for these final thoughts. Really interesting, and I also encourage you to look up that story about the emperor. That was really interesting and entertaining. Okay, Francesc, your presentation is over. Thank you so much for your generosity and enthusiasm. And we will now go on to our last panelist, who is Marcel Cabral. Are you there, Marcelo? Yes, I think so. There he is. Here I am, Paola. How are you? How are you? I'm doing well. I love the Marcel. I love when you call me Marcel. I'll take it, but I'm actually Marcelo. Oh, that's right. Thank you. But I love Marcel. I think I'm going to adopt it outright. Well, since Francesc didn't have the O for Francesco, I cut it off on yours. Sorry about that. Okay, Marcelo Cabrol. He is Argentinian and was named manager of the social sector at the IDB in August of 2017. As a manager, he leads a multidisciplinary team that is convinced that investing in people is the road to improving lives and overcoming the challenges of development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Under his direction, the sector supports countries in providing public policy solutions to reduce poverty and improve education services, labor services, social protection, and health for citizens receiving them. All with the premise of bolstering a more productive region with equal opportunity between men and women, and with more inclusion for the most vulnerable populations. Before being appointed, he was the manager of foreign affairs at the IDP, where Marcel, as I'm going to call him from now on, led deep modernization in the bank's communications. As part of this process, he created the Idear Soluciones program, a business model that applies corporate logic and a creative approach to address issues in matters of health, transportation, energy, and citizen security. This morning, we have analyzed how we judge machines, as we saw with César Hidalgo. And we know that machines are here to stay. And in fact, I just read the other day at Deutsche Welle is that Amazon can predict if someone's pregnant before the person even knows it. And that they are able to know you better than your workmates with whom you've worked for 15 years. That does cause a little bit of fear. I mean, I'm being watched. They even probably know who I'm going to vote for. And I think in Martin's presentation, he said, they know my sexual tendencies as well. So I try and be super careful, but I don't want to know what Amazon knows about me or Google knows about me. So Marcelo, who fears artificial intelligence? Thank you. That's a great question. And if I may, let me just comment on what you just said as an introduction. The digital footprint that Amazon, Facebook, and other major companies have for us is enormous. And the algorithms are very sophisticated, not just data-wise, but also with their capacity to constantly fine-tune the algorithms with that data to predict things just like you're saying. Our tendencies, our situations. But I would also add that it's not just what large companies can do, but also, just like we heard from Francesc a moment ago about what China's doing, on the government side, on both the good and the bad. Let me try and frame your question about who fears artificial intelligence. And of course, let me begin by thanking you all for this invitation. Thanks to RedCLARA. I think this is a very timely talk. I work a lot in education, and many of the things that Francesc said a moment ago really resonated with me. As you said, I work at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I do address public policy, and I also address education, gender, health, and diversity, because I think that that's where the major differences might lie. That's debatable, but I think it's important to me show you at least that this is my track, technology and education to reduce inequality in Latin America. 2 years ago, Paola, the IDB launched FERLAC. FERLAC is a partnership, a public and private partnership together with civil society and academia, where the idea is to promote the responsible use of artificial intelligence. Because we think essentially that right now, that for a development bank, it's very difficult to look at new technologies, especially those most disruptive of all, artificial intelligence, without having an ethical framework. I have to go back to that last slide that Francesc showed. Only I would look at it upside down because we've seen this in Chile and many other countries. Societies cannot accept more technology, but more inequality. So how to ethically apply technology is important. What we never imagined 2 years ago was that we were about to undergo the largest psychological experiment in humanity. The pandemic was the greatest psychological experiment in our history. And this pandemic has intensified many things. What we had 2 years ago, as far as enthusiasm and expectations that led to fair luck, all went up. But then there's also a concern on the risk of abuse of artificial intelligence. And hence what I was saying, companies and governments have been exploring this even before the pandemic, obviously, the use of this technology. But they have had to start many cases much before than they had planned, especially in the sectors I address, such as health and education, but also in others where I don't directly work, but I see, such as mass consumption. With your example of Amazon, that's a very clear case. Now, when we talk about governments in our region, we essentially see that they are quite lagging on the matter. There is a difference between the technology companies and the private sector and governments. But they do have huge pressure to show that digital solutions can be provided for improved services. That is the outlook that governments have. So 2 years ago, again, and everything was 2 years ago to me now, we started to research and write this book with a Mexican collaborator, Roberto Sanchez, and it is called, to your question, Who is Afraid of Intelligence? And it's about the possibility and risks of artificial intelligence and its digital state. As you might imagine, while we were writing over these 2 years, we had to rewrite many sections because as we were writing, we practically needed to rewrite almost immediately. So we're trying to reflect on the new reality under the pandemic. I think we've done so, but I'll let you be the judge and we'll let you know how you can download it and read if you have a chance. But in reality, we do believe that despite the rewrites and all the dilemmas we came across, it is still very much valid in today's conversations. One of the premises under the book is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, in less than 5 years, we will have decision-making support in all public administration. And I know what you're thinking. And this might be it's not even a daring idea, it's somewhat obvious. If that prediction is true, then the consequences to our society is huge. And I know we have very little time, but let me summarize, and I won't be summarizing the book entirely, but I would like to touch on 3 cross-cutting themes that we touched on in the book that we believe will dominate the conversation on artificial intelligence in the next 5 years, and which I think might also be useful to extend this conversation. To make it a little bit more engaging still, and not to tell you the entire book, I will tell you, well, I will try and have these 3 themes be covered by an anecdote in a hypothetical future. It's a little bit science fiction, but it's based on the current trends. So let me tell you about the 3 anecdotes that illustrate some of the questions that we have in the book. Let me begin with the first. The first story is about Graciela. Graciela is a tax auditor in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And just like all of her colleagues in 2025, where we are now, Brazil is now using several software applications to identify irregularities in tax statements and tax filings. And in fact, just to give you some history, Brazil started using artificial intelligence in its customs office almost a decade back. And that's when they also decided to apply this technology to many other fields where they have now been able to combat tax evasion and recover funds. So it turns out that Graciela used these applications to support and fine a major entrepreneur who's a friend of the former president. The business person did not leave it as such and went on the news accusing the government of accusing the auditing systems for political prosecution or persecution, stating that the use of artificial intelligence for tax matters was not duly regulated in Brazilian legislation. Now, when journalists started to investigate who decides and who develops the algorithms at the tax agency, the answers were confusing and contradictory. In little time, a group of legislators announced a bill to ban artificial intelligence on tax matters until many other questions have been answered on governance for these technologies. Now, Graciela's case shows us a reality that we see in the region, and that is that the use of artificial intelligence is growing much faster than the capacity of governments to regulate it, not only in the private sector, but also in many public services. And let me tell you this. This chaotic expansion that we're seeing in private sector and governments will not stop. So the main questions that we explore in the book and that I encourage you to analyze are as follows. First, how do we go about modernizing our institutions and our legislation on these matters in the midst of a continuous storm? Secondly, how do we ensure the ethical use of algorithms? Who will police, so to speak, these algorithms? Thirdly, and very importantly, is it possible that we skip stages, what we call leapfrogging, in governance and in adopting things such as European regulations or certain parts of the US, for example? Those are the first three questions that the book analyzes, and that's why I wanted to tell you the story of Graciela, a story of success and failure. The second anecdote has to do with Andres, which is more suitable to this public. Andres is a high school teacher in Montevideo, Uruguay. In 2001, Uruguay was the first country, as we all know, in launching early warning systems for students at risk of dropping out based on artificial intelligence. In fact, Uruguay is one of the countries with the best education, but the worst when it comes to dropouts. So they're using these early alerts for them. Since Uruguay already had a high level of connectivity and a high wealth of data on the students, the system worked quite well. That's real life. And students with problems now at 2025, the application in 2025 provides recommendations specific to leveling each student by student. That would be customized education in 2025. Andres' problem in this situation is that his professors were not duly trained to react to these kinds of suggestions as to what to do and what not to do. Many of these professors started to teach back in the 90s, and they simply don't have the culture to address their students. Many of the students in Andres' schools are now in an open rebellion against the warning system, and they refuse to use it for their working plans. Many see it as an additional burden that they're not being paid for, but as a result, Andres is actually having a better performance. And this shows us another challenge that we see in the book. It is clear, of course, that artificial intelligence, with modest investment, could help us to diagnose and provide alerts on countless social issues. But here's my question. Are we ready to invest in the structural changes needed to leverage this information? Francesc also talked about this issue. Cultural aspects in this case are about how we educate and work with our educators to incorporate technology. We don't often talk about this. And another question I have for you that the book also addresses is, what is the proper sequence of reform that we should be implementing before backing this technology? So that is Andres' challenge, and that would be that second challenge we address. And then the third and last anecdote, and I'll stop here, is the anecdote having to do with Gladys. Gladys is an administrator in the Jamaican Public Registry. And in 2021, Jamaica approved a digital identification process. This process is actually happening. Jamaica is about to approve this. We're just a few days away. But in my scenario, this is 2021, where they already approved the National Digital Identification System. Now, one of the major issues that came up in discussing that law was the concern by people on the use of biometrics. At the time, the government decided to abandon certain options, for example, retinal scans, to gain the support of the lawmakers. They had to remove that, and that it must be voluntary. Since then, much has been done around what the government expected with the investment. In 2025, we now see the results. The number of undocumented in the country has gone down to half. The segmentation in conditioned deliveries is much more precise than it was in 2021. And the government is now starting to use data to get ahead of the needs of low-income families. But there are several segments in the population that are refusing to participate in the system. Some do so for religious reasons. Some say that because the government has no proper safeguards to protect privacy, even in 2025. And in turn, public hospitals in Jamaica have implemented a medical registry process that is not compatible with a digital identification card. And since we're talking about Jamaica, several of the hotels in the tourism part of the country are setting up their own facial recognition systems as security for their employees. These platforms are also not compatible with the national ID. So Gladys and her colleagues at the Civil Registry see that every day the identification system is increasingly fragmented and partial, the opposite of what they wanted. They fear that they will never achieve the critical mass for proper operations as they wanted. And meanwhile, digital technology has changed at an exponential pace, so much so that the system is now in danger of becoming obsolete. Now, Gladys represents another phenomenon that we studied in the book. Even in the best of cases, implementing artificial intelligence in the public sector entails significant management challenges. The private sector offers new technologies based on its own priorities and its own business models. And governments seldom have people that are capable of contracting services with a long-term view and a strategic vision. These are some of the issues that we are anticipating. They are simple to explain, difficult to address, but very important in public policy and technology. I think I've spoken very much, so I'd love to hear now from you what you see on the horizon, Paola. And I thank you for this time, and I'm pleased to be here once again. Thank you, Marcelo. We have a very long conversation ahead of us. Unfortunately, though, time is always one step ahead. But we understand that we will continue to have these conversations with Marcelo. But I do have a couple of questions. Yes, plus I have the power today, so I'm going to take advantage of that and ask you these two questions. With all these things you said around data protection and deploying management capacity in governments, I mean, I thought that information security was epic, but I didn't know it was that epic. It's enormous. So I wanted to ask you one question regarding our role as networks for research and the role that we must play in artificial intelligence from the technology side, but also in upper levels. In your view, what are the habilitating factors when using artificial intelligence and doing it properly? I'm not sure if that's the word, but with the care that must be taken, let's say, what would be our role there? There are things that we need to continue to research in order to show evidence and also to provide peace of mind to our stakeholders in saying that the work we're doing does indeed improve people's lives and not that, well, let's put it this way. The matter of privacy and data protection is extremely important, and the networks must continue to work in showing the tools and the safeguards that truly work in maintaining privacy and data protection. Australia, if you didn't see this, approved a law that gives the police the possibility through administrative channels to access everyone's data in social networks. Doesn't matter if it's Facebook, doesn't matter if it's Amazon, doesn't matter who it is. The police will be able to do this, just like the police can do this in other countries when using our phone data. So it is coming. In Latin America, privacy and data protection is one of the first things that must be addressed, of course. Secondly, and I think that this is a little bit more thorny, but very important, anything that is manipulation and exploration especially when it comes to vulnerable users. It isn't just about use. There's where data shouldn't only be private, but should not be abused, especially with those who have fewer possibilities of defending themselves. And then lastly, and this is still, and I'm going from the most thorny to the least thorny, then comes everything having to do with fake news and manipulation and subverting democracy, basically. Networks must work on this as well, and we cannot leave it only up to the journalists and only up to the media. Think tanks and civil society has very strong work to do. By the way, universities as well. Thinking of Francesc as well. So it is a thorny road. Yes, I can see that, but they're necessary. They're necessary. And I'd like to ask you one last thing. Our time is almost up, but I heard that in a presentation you gave in a forum in January, February of this year, in Chile actually, that there was a project in the IESALC for education using algorithms.
What
is the current status of this project, and where do you want to go with that? Well, there are two projects actually. And we are quite in an advanced stage where we are in the application stage. It's a simple yet complicated idea at the same time. The simple part is basically about going into what we talked about in the book, using predictive models that essentially allow us to provide public policy for people before the crisis, before the catastrophe. What's actually complicated, and this is and it's always a complicated issue, is that, okay, now I know that Paola has a very high likelihood of dropping out of school, let's say. So how do I make customized policy to resolve that issue? And the governments don't have that plasticity. Programmatically speaking, government proposals and education systems come much slower than our capacity to predict Paola's predicaments. So that's kind of the dilemma we have. And it's an ethical dilemma because I know that something is going to happen to you, and my role as government is to provide the means so that it doesn't happen. So that's one of the main conversations we're having now. We're in a rush programmatically now to match predictions with solutions. And then the other program that is somewhat slower is personalizing education. And we're doing this in Argentina currently, where the idea is that we essentially start to find ways so that teachers can use algorithms to see how children are learning. But that entails ethical issues still that we have not been able to navigate. So that comes a little bit slower. This means that these are ethical issues. Well, there's an issue here in that professors have a universal culture of teaching, and it leads to some being left behind and some moving much forward, and it's difficult to level that currently. So how do we find a way so that educators provide differential education? It isn't a professor issue. It's an issue for the entire education system and how we see it. So technology is moving faster than, like I said in my presentation, than we can address as far as the technology ecosystem. That's really interesting. I'll be telling you more about that very soon, actually. Yes, Marcel. I won't call you Marcelo anymore. Forget it. It's Marcel now. That's right. It is Marcel. I'm changing my e-signature. I changed it while we were talking here, in fact. Okay, from now on, your new life begins as Marcel. You're going to have to re-register in Amazon. Okay. That's right. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Yes, thank you for your invitation as well. Take care. Bye. Bye. With Marcelo, with Marcel, we now conclude our session with panelists, and I'll give the floor back now to Maria Jose. Thank you, Paola. Thanks to you as well. You have been a spectacular host. We are truly fascinated here behind the scenes over WhatsApp and everything else. We've just been commenting on that super great job you've been doing. So thank you so much. I also thank you for your contributions, Francesc, Pedró, Marcelo Cabral, or Marcel Cabral now, and César Hidalgo. We're very happy because this has been an extremely fruitful morning. So thank you so much, everyone. We will now continue, and we'd like to do so with a presentation and the signing of the agreement for the incident response team, CSIRT, which is established now in the region thanks to the RedCLARA members. And with that, I leave you with Emilio Tissato Nakamura from the Academic Brazilian Network, RNT. Go ahead, Emilio. Hello, thank you very much.
I'm going to be speaking Portuguese. Taking advantage of the fact that we have simultaneous translation, and so you don't need to talk to me in my Portuguese. So, good afternoon to everyone. I would like to make a short presentation, need or trust, and those countries regarding the critical infrastructure protection. So I want to apologize. I want to congratulate all of you because we have a big group of cybersecurity for the academic network in Latin America. This is just the beginning. This the beginning of that we have 5 big institutions. And the next slide, if we could see it, we may see the name of the group. The name of the group is Cyber Security and Studies from Education in Latin America. Could we see it now? Okay, thank you. Now we can see it. So this is a group that we have 5 organizations. This is the start of this work from CLARA Network with cooperation in Latin America. We have CEDIA from Ecuador, Fuji from Mexico, and REUNA from Chile. So we have several initiatives. We could see TICAL, several actions that are being performed in very important topics. And that group is going to enforce the cooperation so we could have synergies and they can be greater, and we can also execute several projects in a jointly manner for different branches in Latin America. So those are the main action lines we have in this group. I would like to show a little bit the context that I brought the training for the group. So the next slide, please. It shows a context where we have the environment which the pandemic accelerated somehow, where information, we have everything that's distributed, and we also have a mixture between corporate and private. This is on the cloud, so we have physical distributed places, people working from home, universities and organizations. We have different devices being used, personal data being used by personal devices and institutional devices. So all these data that is spread and distributed throughout different institutions. One of the difficulties is the context, is the use of new technologies and new use scenarios with digital transformation that accelerates the process, and it brings more challenges with regards to cybersecurity, intelligent cities, smart cities, and critical infrastructure protection, and new technologies that increase complexity. Internet of Things, and this is one of the examples. So what we have in this context is that environments are well distributed. The perimeter, the traditional perimeter to work, basically we don't have that limit. we have an expansion of that limit, that boundary. And a reflection of that, we have seen in the whole world that we have an increased number of security incidents, cybersecurity incidents that require intervention and response to cyber attacks. The whole context shows that it is necessary to have new skills for cybersecurity in that increasingly complex environment. The need to work in a different way with cybersecurity, and also the need of new technologies of cybersecurity. So the next slide, please. Apart from this context that we have the regulatory framework aspect. Countries have worked with laws, national strategies. They've worked with regulations, standards that make institutions and organizations to try to deal with the topic in a more organized manner. So we have contributed a lot in this aspect. Tanya, please, the next slide. An important context we have is a report from World Economic Forum that points out cybersecurity as one of the great risks in the whole world today with the digital inequality. This is a very important, relevant point. And the influence of cybersecurity is related to economical drawbacks and social instability as well. So this is pretty relevant. Next slide, we have certain figures with regards to cybersecurity. We have the issue of cybersecurity position, the way organizations deal with the issue. 78% of these companies do not trust in this position. 80% of leaders in the world do not trust and the protection against cybersecurity that are increasingly more sophisticated. We also have some important data regarding the health networks. 90% of these organizations suffered an incident in the last 3 years. The growth of malware in 2020 was 358% of growth of malware incidents. And we also had 435% of growth. And we have a big trend because that has taken place in 2021. The number of malware, and we have a very important, relevant issue for privacy and cybersecurity in the supply chain. We have had attacks of 420%. That's we need integration among organizations, and we need to have a co-accountability. This shows exactly that type of exploitation that criminals take advantage of. The cost of cyber crime, it's 10 trillions in 2025. That's predicted. So we also have the cost of data processing. It's $3.6 billion, and the market of cybersecurity is going to be increasing 403 billion next for 2027. We have a lot of important information. Next slide, please. So it's related to the talent in that area, but we need those talents. We need training and education. These are important data related to the impact at global level. We have the issue of cybersecurity. The 24/7 has to be active. So the report shows the complexity of the environment, that it's in the surrounding, the perimeters, the new emerging threats, and also the issue of direct impacts on people and or citizens. So on the important number here, cybersecurity, we've contributed a lot in that sense. The name of post vacancies, which is nearly 3.5 million vacancies in this area in the whole world. So next slide shows these numbers in a more detailed manner. We have another survey related to the to the training. Next slide, please. All right, thank you. So the issue of the need of have professionals in the area, these survey shows that the growth of this personnel is needed at least 89% to have a right and accurate defense against cyber attacks in this area. Important data here for Latin America is that we have 527,000 professionals. That's the gap we have to fill in Latin America. We need 527,000 professionals in cybersecurity. So that job we have to contribute so that we could work to improve those figures and contribute effectively to this general scenario involving all the countries and organizations. Next slide shows the main action lines from groups. They are actions that are very relevant within this context. The first action line is the certification of cybersecurity for member institutions from the CLARA network. And the group is going to look for ways to certify institutions that are following the minimal security standard so that we could provide services, safe services, secure services for all the community, and also the issue of professionals in security. The second action line is the development of tools and cybersecurity services. So we can see that the context is evolving towards that general need of services and also the tools so that they could act jointly with those professionals. The third action line that's important is the training program, an educational program, awareness program in cybersecurity. That's very important for us, where security is our responsibility of all of us, working with the professional and from the user side to improve the situation. So we may have fewer incidents of security in all organizations and countries. And the fourth line of action is a partnership with organizations and manufacturers, strengthening the ecosystem of cybersecurity. It's a very important point. Many actions taking place in the academia and also in the market. So that approach is very important so we could evolve in the effective security of the academic networks. So the next slide, please. So this is the end of what I wanted to thank the conformation of the group. I wanted to invite the other members to be part of this group, so that we have here a lot of challenges, but we also have a lot of opportunities in this sense. And I wanted to thank you and wish you the best.
A que aparezcan en pantalla y participen con nosotros. Otra vez nuestra querida Paola Arellano, directora ejecutiva de REUNA.
Our dear Paola
Casasús
Arellano will be helping us with the next section for to address questions.
Red Académica Ecuatoriana.
Juan Pablo Carvallo from the and Nelson Simões are joining us for this section from the Brazilian Academic Network, who will now be signing the memorandum of understanding between these networks to create the cybersecurity group in education and research networks for Latin America. Please go ahead. Thank you, Maria Jose, and greetings to everyone. This has been an extremely enriching session today. I wanted to mention that the agreement was just signed today. I just received a copy, in fact, that is signed, and I will be gladly sharing so that our audience can see today's ceremony. And this reminds me of the signing that we had last year in Latin America of the Roots, which is also growing strong very significantly. And it truly reflects the value and the importance that we're giving to security in our networks, and also what this means as far as an opportunity as a service to support the security to whom we provide the service. So I will not go over too long. I would just like the respective directors from national networks talk about the relevance of this ceremony, and I will share my screen to show you the document that we have all just signed.
Primero, Paula.
¿Yo? No se cansan de escucharme.
Pablo first. I thought you were tired of listening to me. Oh, okay. Well, actually, I am extremely happy with this signing. I remember a few years ago when I called Juan Pablo Carvallo to establish a collaboration agreement that would allow Chile to assume CEDIA's experience, which had moved forward in that sense, and to work towards consolidating the efforts in Chile. It hasn't been that many years, and we have moved forward extensively. It's impressive. It's very impressive to see what we have ahead of us. I've had the fortune of engaging in these initiatives, and beyond learning about the progress being made, which is so important, what's really impressive are the opportunities that are opening up and the responsibility that we have as a network. So I would just celebrate that this is yet another very important step in consolidating these work groups and in providing the support that we must. And we're working together. We can do many more things. So I'm just very happy to see this, and I hope that new networks will join in this initiative. Thank you.
I'm also very happy to be here with my friends from other organizations and other initiatives. So it's a pleasure to be with you, really. And I think that we have the security challenges and also the challenge that we face together in terms of qualifying human talent, checking the fragilities and opportunities that we may have in our national systems for education, research, innovation, and very likely in cybersecurity. And so this issue turned into something important. A lot of us had a lot of initiatives there, and we'll continue working in terms of regarding health and many other networks and applications, cooperation. I think that what RedCLARA, what they did is calling the attention to organize capacities in these initiatives. So this is also going to be very important for all of us, because we could show that we are concerned. We have the feature that makes us different from other initiatives, that is that neutrality, that the character of use of common development of a public good that reaches our community, but also the society as a whole. So this is a security area that's very important. We need to build those links to demonstrate that, in fact, we could work and do a lot of things together. So I just wanted to take advantage to thank you all for the whole work we've been doing together. And what Paula said, we are going to bring the other networks, even if it's a construction work in other networks. And we need to start with the first contacts. We all began that way. So that is important, because we will have a RedCLARA network way stronger. I wanted to congratulate Luis for the initiative.
Igual que Nelson y Paola, sumamente contento.
Just like Nelson and Paula have said, we are extremely happy with this initiative. in learning from each other, learning from other countries. We've learned from Brazil, and we have also had a chance to work with Paola and Carlos in Mexico. So we hope to continue in this dynamic, which I think is the reason why networks are even created. It isn't just to receive services or guidance, but to also support other partners in their development and growth, in supporting all of us. We signed a telemedicine initiative for Latin America last year, for example, where, given that health has been such a key topic over this year and a half, but it still needs more development in other regions in the coming year. So we are now just starting to see the first results, and we are inviting all the member countries to come forward with specific projects with clinics, hospitals, and medication. And then cybersecurity is, of course, another important issue that is as relevant and what more relevant event than the new Bella cable being inaugurated, where we will have channels with much more capacity now and better connectivity for our members. And that makes it so that we must also improve other areas such as cybersecurity and data protection, which goes hand in hand with that, because that will be critical. If we, for example, have medical information, or information from researchers in our networks, in our servers, well, then it's important that that go together with cybersecurity initiatives. So I'm very happy to sign this agreement that will surely enrich us and strengthen us in the region. Carlos? You're on mute. Sorry about that. Yes, here I would highlight the need of being a member and in having resources that provide security. CUDI did a survey amongst our members, and surprisingly, we did find an impressive response to this security survey that in and of itself tells us of the great interest that there is in the various IT departments in our universities in having better security resources. And this led us to developing a strategy to provide our services to our members, security services, that is. And these services are quite consistent with what we're trying to do with this memorandum, and trying to certify the campuses that connect to the network, and to try and provide training to the personnel that needs it dramatically, to become updated on the challenges that are growing and in leveraging technologies to overcome them. Providing tools that we deploy collectively on the networks to protect the traffic going through it, together with the possibility of establishing partnerships with many companies, many services companies that provide cybersecurity, and bringing them closer to the universities collectively. With our collective power, I think that will have a dramatic impact. I feel that if national education networks become a safe environment and universities begin to trust that in belonging to networks will allow them to enter into this safer enclave than the open internet, than the commercial internet, well, then that will give them further reasons to participate in our associations and continue to play this role of creating a regional public good and a cooperative enclave that will that is hard to find in the world. I don't know of any other when it comes to research. So I am really happy to see you all again through this signing, and thank you all as well for this collective effort that we have deployed in the last few months to now come to this signing. So congratulations, because I know that this will be a significant milestone in RedCLARA's initiatives. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, round of applause. Why not? Congratulations. Congratulations to all of you for this major achievement. There is immense work behind all of this that will undoubtedly provide many fruits to the region as a whole. It's an honor and a privilege to work at an institution that does this kind of work for our society. I'd like to thank all of you. And we are not saying goodbye yet. We will begin with the closing ceremony. And I will give you some good news. Just now, when we had the issue with the screen, I mentioned that we would have awards, prizes, and we decided in our creative committee, where usually that I usually lead, that we will be giving a special award out today, given all the great comments and the great turnout and the great participation by all the attendees at every stage of this conference, together with the demos and the games and the stands and everything else. So we will now be issuing the prize, and first place in our game was had by Irene Whitebard Diaz. She won a tablet. Congratulations to you, Irene. We will be in touch with you. Second place is Gilberto Guerra Blanco, who won $500 in AWS credit to use cloud services. Daniel Lozaratam won $300 also in AWS credit for its web services. And in fourth place, Salado de Jesus Guzman, who won $200 in AWS services as well. Congratulations to all of you, and thank you for your enthusiasm in participating. We had many, many participants in our game, so it's great to see the support. And for this, of course, I thank AWS for its sponsorship and help in this game. We are now about to close this final plenary session at TICAL2021 and this fifth Latin American meeting on e-science. But that doesn't mean that we don't have work for the rest of the day, because of course we have the workshops and parallel presentations and all of that. But we will now close the plenary session as such. And for that, before giving the virtual floor to the Executive Director of RedCLARA, Luis Eliécer Cadenas, I'd like to remind you that you can still visit our virtual stands with our demos and sponsors and share your experiences on social networks using hashtag ConfTical2021. And of course, do not forget that parallel sessions and workshops are beginning in a few minutes. Goodbye to you for now. I thank you all for your company this week and hope to meet you very soon, face to face, and give you a hug in the coming year. Thank you very much for joining us. And now I will leave you with the Executive Director of RedCLARA, Luis Eliécer Cadenas. Go ahead, Luis. Thank you very much, Maria Jose, and thanks to all of you, participants in this TICAL2021. Honestly, today, I feel both happy and sad simultaneously. I think in Portuguese, or at least in Brazilian Portuguese, it's called saudade or something like that. So I'm happy because it's been an exceptional TICAL. It's been an effort over many months, and believe me, when we are able to create an event such as this with this quality of panelists and these activities, behind it all, there is a lot of work and many months of effort from various stakeholders that are helping us to structure a TICAL and make it a success, and to make it a benchmark for our region and our annual meeting of education and research networks. I'd like to begin by having a brief overview of what we saw during the event, to then close the plenary session. And as you heard from Maria Jose, again, there will be parallel sessions this afternoon. And we, of course, invite you to come to TICAL next year. But first of all, I did want to share some figures on TICAL 2021. How many people participated and some main statistics around the event. We had a total number of 1,590 people registered, with 864 users logging in, with 1,189 hours of content transmitted, 682 spectators in plenary sessions and parallel sessions, 80,606 pages visited, which is an average of 50.7 pages visited per user, and 529 gaming challenges completed. This shows the interest and the importance and the relevance of TICAL to all of us in the region. We are very pleased for having been able to structure an event of this quality. We began the event by inaugurating the new capacity that we now have with the underwater cable connecting Europe with Latin America. I mentioned in that introduction, in that presentation, how this can entail significant change in capacity and in cooperation between Latin America and Europe, and the possibility of moving forward in matters as diverse as those that we've seen throughout this event: artificial intelligence, matters having to do with the use of information and data management, and supporting scientific and research activities, supporting open science as well in the region. The cable actually represents a significant change with respect to our previous connectivity, and this is now already starting to provide results. I also mentioned the goal that we have for the coming years to complete Latin American connectivity. Today, with Bella, we are only reaching out to 4 or 5 countries in the region, and the intent is to have this resource and this opportunity for connectivity be equal for all countries in the region, where they can all benefit from this connectivity and capacity.
Una presentación fantástica de Martin Hilbert.
We then had a fantastic presentation from Martin Hilbert, who always surprises us with his ability to analyze in such a broad and deep manner all the issues having to do with artificial intelligence and big data and its impact.
También hemos visto a lo largo del resto de la reunión y de las actividades del evento.
And as well as in other matters that we've seen throughout this event, such as privacy and security, even personal security, when addressing data that is made available to many organizations, both public and private. We also had the opportunity of sharing a round table with women leaders in a round table, leaders in research and education in Latin America, where we were joined by Paola Arellano, the director of REUNA in Chile, Patricia Hernandez from the UNAHH in Honduras, Ida Holt, who's our promoter and dear friend in Latin America for many years, Mariela de Leon from the Uruguayan Academic Network, and Cecilia Paredes, the dean and chair of CEDIA, the executive committee at CEDIA in Ecuador. We had a magnificent presentation from Pavel Sivoda on eBrains, which is the organization that was created through a flagship program, a 10-year flagship program in pursuit of understanding how the brain works. And Pavel told us about the relevance of data as a tool for this analysis and how the company that was created under the initiative on the Human Brain Project is offering a collaborative space with Latin America for research in this field that is now further strengthened thanks to this new connectivity that we have inaugurated very recently. We also had a presentation from Chris Hatterton from Jean on Copernicus and the relevance of the Copernicus program, together with the amounts of data that it produces for issues as important as climate change, disaster management, and sustainable development, and also how this connectivity and how this enormous amount of data can be used for analysis and understanding the phenomenon, and in turn provide benefits to the population and to the Latin American region. We also had the Pan American Health Organization present, showing the work that's been done with the University Network of Telemedicine in Latin America that we just mentioned in signing the contract or the agreement. This activity is growing and progressing and creating increasingly more interest and benefits for the community of specialists in health in the region. We had, of course, our dear Luis Messina as well, leading this initiative for many years in Brazil, who helped us to become inspired on one hand and to also to create this collaborative effort, which is really the trademark of RedCLARA and what it does with its members. It is continuous improvement to empower our ability and supplement each other. We also had a magnificent presentation today from César Hidalgo, looking at how we assess machines, how we evaluate machines, and what we understand when a machine or an algorithm makes decisions, and how we compare that to humans under the same conditions. We had an excellent presentation from Francesc Pedró talking about the challenges in higher education and the impact of technology, particularly the impact of artificial intelligence. We also had Marcelo, but apparently he's Marcel now, thanks to Paola. Marcel Cabral from the Inter-American Development Bank, with the initiatives having to do with the ethical use of artificial intelligence and the impact that AI might have, and the considerations that must be kept in mind when deploying it. And I would also highlight that we are also working in RedCLARA and its members, together with the IDB and its BitLab, in partnership with blockchain and ACNIC, to provide infrastructure and support in services and blockchain services. It's a project, it's an initiative, and it's a service that will greatly help in digital inclusion and equity in the region. The fact that these organizations are joining efforts to develop this capacity and offer it to the various public and private organizations in the region as a tool for working with these types of technologies, that will provide great benefits, and we feel honored and proud of being part of this history that we are now starting to create. I obviously couldn't go without mentioning the great support of our program committee. You can see them here in some of the various meetings that we held. Without the programs committee and their support and their knowledge on how to create what we created, it would have been very difficult to achieve the quality that we have achieved for the program here. I also wanted to greatly thank my team at RedCLARA, who, as always, gave it their all during the event. This has been a fantastic experience as far as the way in which we've been able to work to make sure that everything that happens at the event be done the best way possible. I feel very proud of all of you, and I just want to thank you, Tanya, especially you, because you are responsible for content and the substantial part of the project and the TICAL program. And I feel, at least, that of the 4 TICALs that I've had the honor of leading, in a way, I believe that this has been the one with the best content and with the best participation and impact for our community. I wanted to go back to a very important message that I tried to convey during the inauguration, and it's about the importance of data, scientific data, and in general, and in a broader sense, data in research and in supporting open science models for Latin America. As you know, and I mentioned this previously, UNESCO is working on approving a recommendation document on open science where there are main pillars to promote this model and collective work on the use of scientific data in research and its products, where for our region, it is indispensable to begin to complete that ecosystem in support of open science. Here, I have mentioned 3 major organizations that have had a lot to do with this. On one hand, the Latin American Network of Supercomputing. You've seen in the various presentations how relevant computing power is in leveraging digital transformation technologies, particularly AI, and what we can achieve through deep learning networks and other technologies using AI that greatly depend on computing power. And that computing power determines how much we can do through algorithms and AI, and how much and how many benefits we can gain in studying and producing results and in providing a benefit to society and the Latin American community. La Referencia is a project that began with IDB financing using for public goods. And today, it is growing and it is developing in a fantastic manner under the leadership of Bianca Amaro and with the support of several countries in the region. They have been able to deploy technological and organizational infrastructure that today has basically 3 million documents harvested in the La Referencia platform to contribute greatly to open science and access to knowledge produced in Latin America that we need to learn. And then RedCLARA, who has been contributing to this for, I forget how many years now, since 2003 to date, 18 years, and building a connectivity infrastructure that is indispensable in sharing data and accessing that computing resource and in connecting to scientific publications. And there's one major player missing here, and it's really important that we work on in the coming years. And we three organizations are already coordinating and finding the way to supplement managing data, scientific data. There is huge potential there. And honestly, scientific data as produced by our researchers are a tool that if we are able to leverage properly, we will be able to overcome many more issues than we have so far, thanks to science, and will allow for a much more relevant impact in society through knowledge. All we have to do is look at what's been happening with the pandemic and the way in which, thanks to that capacity globally, a series of vaccines were produced in record time, which are now helping us to overcome this very complicated situation. So our goal, together with ESCALAC, La Referencia, and with La Referencia leading in this field, is to complete this ecosystem that involves other stakeholders that must be incorporated to establish a methodology and a dynamic and a set of technologies behind it that would allow for the data being produced through the research in Latin America to interconnect and to be processed with enough processing power, and that can be then made available to the regional community to for better development for the region. So going back to the initial aspirations that I had at the start of the event, these are our 5 main goals for the coming years. To complete connectivity for Latin America through the Bella and Bella-associated projects in 2030, achieve connectivity for national networks in education and research under this new connectivity that is being planned with Asia and Australia through the Humboldt cable, and then the dream that we've had for several years and that we've been promoting for Antarctica connectivity. With this agreement that we just signed to work on cybersecurity, we also aspire to become a benchmark in cybersecurity in the field of education, especially higher education and research worldwide. To complete the open science initiative, to expand Bella's infrastructure, and to serve as a regional articulator to achieve digital transformation and ensure that those digital transformation processes can be leveraged by our countries despite their differences, culturally, economically, for the benefit of the entire population and the collective development of our society. I'd like to, before concluding, invite you to a very important event that will be taking place in October, online, organized by ESCALAC, the Latin American Supercomputing Network, which will take place between October 4th and 8th. And you're all invited there, where we will meet again in a series of very relevant talks, together with some panels that where we will also be looking at the impacts of public policy on matters of cooperation and supercomputing. Lastly, I would remind you that we are now in the future, and that is what this slide shows. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, IoT, and all the other technologies for digital transformation are deeply changing our productive capacity in our countries, and we must therefore find the mechanisms through our research networks to support those digital transformation processes in the region. I think there we have a lot to do yet. We have many opportunities to bring in all of our members as well as all of the society's stakeholders, and you can count on our support in building that better future for all of us through the use of knowledge, data, and infrastructure, for which we have invested so many efforts and so much love and so much cooperation regionally. I feel proud, greatly proud, of the cooperation capacity that our members have, and I hope that this agreement that we signed today, and that in a way replicates the agreement we signed for health, is multiplied many times over in other cooperation initiatives that come from this collaborative capacity that we've developed over the years, and that will ultimately benefit us all as it should be. So with that, I would like to conclude our TICAL2021 and thank each and every one of you for your interest and your participation. It is not easy in a situation such as this, where we have all been online day and night. It's not easy to have our participants engage the way you did with our content, with the platform that we were able to deploy thanks to the support of the companies that helped us with this. And well, for having had such fruitful sessions. Next year, hopefully, we hope to have the in-person version, but we will not leave online behind, because I think it's really important that content and that any reflections made under TICAL reach the broadest audience possible in the region. So, God willing, if we are able to have that in-person meeting, we will nevertheless have the online session as well. So we will likely have a semi-virtual version of TICAL for 2022. Very thankful to all of you for joining us. Thankful for your support in these initiatives. And I hope you enjoy the rest of TICAL. And we'll see you very soon. Because as of today, we are now starting to work on the next TICAL with the lessons learned from this event, together with the contributions that you have sent in through our platform. It was a pleasure to have you all here online, and it was a pleasure to have undertaken all these efforts to achieve the results that we have today. Thank you very much.